As my name is Elena, I am 34 years old, but most people in my life have always called me Dakota. And at 34, I learned the hardest truth of my life: grief doesn't break you all at once. It does it slowly and quietly while the world keeps moving like nothing happened. I became a widow on a Tuesday afternoon when Mark died on a construction site. One moment he was kissing my forehead and telling Tommy he'd bring home fries after work, and the next a police officer stood in my living room speaking in a calm, rehearsed tone, like this wasn't the worst day of my life. Tommy was 7, too young to understand why his dad wasn't coming home, but old enough to feel the silence settle into the house. That night, I sat on the floor with my back against the couch holding my son as he cried himself to sleep. And I didn't cry because when you're a mom, survival comes first, and falling apart feels like a luxury you can't afford. Mark's parents, Sarah and Jim, arrived before my own parents even called. Sarah held Tommy like she was afraid he'd disappear, and Jim stood in the doorway nodding at me as if making a quiet promise that I wasn't alone, and they meant it because they cooked and cleaned and showed up without asking questions or bringing up money or expectations. They just loved us. My parents, on the other hand, sent a text saying they were sorry for my loss and to let them know if I needed anything, and then they didn't come. This wasn't new because growing up my sister Rachel had always been the priority. The golden child who never did wrong, while I learned how to stay quiet and not ask for much and be low maintenance so I wouldn't be a burden. I honestly believed losing my husband would finally change something, but I was wrong. A few weeks after the funeral, the calls started with concern that felt more like accounting. Questions about life insurance and reminders that family helps family, and comments about how Rachel was having a hard time too. I stared at my phone wondering how grief always turned into guilt when my parents were involved. Then Christmas came, and by December grief wasn't sharp anymore, just heavy, like carrying a weight you couldn't put down. Mark had loved Christmas, and that year I hadn't planned to decorate at all until Tommy asked if his dad would be sad if we didn't put up the tree, and something in me cracked enough to move. Mark's parents came over with decorations and hot cocoa, and we put the tree up together, and Tommy smiled for the first time in weeks. Then my mother called to say they were doing Christmas at Rachel's 3 hours away, and that it would be good for me to come. She didn't ask how I was doing, and when I said I didn't feel up to traveling, she sighed and said Rachel had already planned everything and that staying home wasn't healthy. Then she added that Rachel and her husband were short on money after hosting, and that the life insurance would help everyone relax a little. That was the moment the room went quiet in my head, because suddenly it wasn't about Christmas or healing, but about what they expected from me. I told her that money was for Tommy's future and for keeping our home, and she laughed lightly and said I was overreacting and that Mark would have wanted me to support family. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table shaking while Tommy colored beside me, and I realized this was the same pattern I'd lived my whole life, except now, my silence didn't just hurt me, it hurt my son. Christmas morning we stayed home. Mark's parents came over and we made pancakes and watched Tommy open presents, and later that afternoon, my phone exploded with messages accusing me of being selfish and dramatic and ungrateful. And when my father finally called, he said I was tearing the family apart over money. That was when I finally spoke clearly and told him that what was tearing the family apart was their inability to see me as anything other than a resource. He hung up on me, and for the first time in my life, I didn't chase after him with apologies. The weeks that followed were quiet and painful, but also strangely peaceful. I stopped answering guilt-filled calls and started building routines for Tommy and for myself. I cried for the first time alone in the shower where no one needed anything from me, and I realized grief hadn't just taken my husband, it had stripped away the illusion that love from some people comes without conditions. Mark's parents stayed, steady and kind. And I learned that family isn't who shares your blood, but who shows up when your world collapses and doesn't ask for anything in return, and that Christmas taught me something else too, that protecting my child and myself wasn't selfish, it was survival. And for the first time since that Tuesday afternoon, I felt like maybe, just maybe, we were going to be okay. It was mid-December when my mom called with that careful tone she uses when she knows she's about to say something wrong, but still wants credit for being honest. And the moment I heard it, my stomach tightened because that tone had followed me my entire life. She said they were doing Christmas dinner on the 25th, and that it would be something small and adults only. I blinked because for a second I thought I'd misheard her. I asked what she meant by adults only, and she rushed to explain that it would just be easier that way this year. I looked over at Tommy, sitting at the table coloring a picture for Santa, with his tongue stuck out in concentration, and my chest tightened in a way that felt almost physical. I asked her quietly if Rachel's kids would be there, and there was a pause just long enough to tell me everything before she admitted that yes, they would be, but that it was different. That word landed harder than she probably expected, because different had always been the explanation for why Rachel got more patience, more forgiveness, more love. I didn't raise my voice or argue, I just reminded her that Tommy had lost his father this year, and there was another pause longer this time before she said that they couldn't make exceptions for everyone, as if my 7-year-old grieving son was just another inconvenience on a guest list. That night, I told Sarah and Jim what had happened, and instead of soft sympathy, I saw something sharper cross Sarah's face as her hands shook pouring tea, and she repeated the words back like she needed to hear them herself. They excluded him. Jim sat silently for a long time before saying in a low, steady voice that any child who lost his father was family, and anyone who couldn't see that didn't deserve him. While all of this was happening, my parents were also increasing the pressure about the insurance money Mark had left behind. It wasn't a massive amount, but it was enough to give Tommy a future if I handled it carefully. College someday, a stable home, the kind of security Mark had always wanted for him. My mom framed her requests like concerns, saying my father's business could really use a little help right now, while Rachel dropped all pretense and told me flat out that I wouldn't even have that money if Mark hadn't died. That sentence stayed with me in a way that made my hands shake, because it reduced my husband's life and death to a transaction, and my son's future to something they felt entitled to. After that, I started noticing things I'd ignored for years, like invitations that arrived late or not at all. Family photos posted online where Tommy was missing. Conversations that suddenly shifted or stopped when I entered the room. It felt like I was finally seeing the truth without the fog of obligation blurring it, and yet through all of this, Sarah and Jim never wavered. They showed up to soccer practice and school meetings and random Tuesdays with groceries and gentle hugs. They remembered the little things like Tommy's favorite cereal and how he liked his blanket tucked in. One night after Tommy fell asleep on Jim's chest while they watched an old movie, I went into the kitchen and cried for the first time since Mark died, because it finally felt safe to do so. Sarah didn't tell me to be strong or say everything would be okay, she just held me while I cried like my grief wasn't something that needed fixing or minimizing. In that moment, I understood something I wish I'd learned sooner. That blood alone doesn't make people family, and shared DNA doesn't guarantee love or protection. Family is made by the people who choose you when it's inconvenient, who show up without being asked, and who see your child's pain as their own. And as Christmas approached, I stopped trying to convince my parents to understand or change, because I realized that protecting my son mattered more than chasing approval I had never truly been given. That winter didn't magically heal my grief, but it gave me clarity and taught me that the people who stayed when everything fell apart were the ones who truly belonged in our lives. And for the first time since losing Mark, I felt something steady beneath the sadness. The knowledge that Tommy and I weren't alone, and that the family who chose us was stronger than the one who kept excluding us. The final straw came in January when my dad called, and this time there was no softness in his voice and no pretending to care. He told me I was being selfish and that the money could help all of us, and when I repeated his words back to him and said, "You mean Rachel," there was a silence so heavy it answered the question for me. I asked what about Tommy and reminded him that they wouldn't even let him come to Christmas, and from the background I heard my mother say that it was my choice and that I was turning him against them. And in that moment, something in me snapped, but not in a loud, dramatic way. It snapped quietly and cleanly, like a switch finally flipping into place. I told them I was done, and they laughed at first like I was bluffing because they were used to me backing down, but I wasn't. I blocked their numbers and I blocked Rachel, and I closed that door without slamming it because I didn't want chaos or revenge, I wanted peace. I met with a financial advisor and set up a trust for Tommy that covered his education, housing, and long-term security, and I made sure every dollar was accounted for, and every decision was made with my son's future in mind. When I told Sarah and Jim about it, Jim just nodded like he already knew I would choose my child over pressure, and Sarah told me they were proud of me, and that Mark would be too. That night, Tommy asked me a question that broke my heart all over again when he looked up at me and asked if he had done something wrong, and I pulled him close and told him never, not once, and that some people just don't know how to love the right way. After that, we started creating new traditions of our own, like pancake Sundays and movie nights and road trips filled with loud music and terrible snacks, and Sarah taught Tommy how to bake, while Jim taught him how to fix things and how to throw a baseball without getting frustrated. And slowly, laughter found its way back into our home, not the same as before, and not without scars, but real and warm and ours. It's been a year now, and time hasn't erased Mark from my life the way people like to promise it will. I still miss him every day in small, quiet ways, like reaching for my phone to tell him something or instinctively saving the corner seat on the couch. Grief didn't disappear, it just changed shape and softened enough that it no longer controlled every breath I took. I learned how to carry it without letting it crush me, and through that slow, painful process, I watched Tommy begin to heal too. He started smiling again without forcing it. Laughing without immediately looking around like he was doing something wrong. He sleeps through the night now and talks about his dad without his voice breaking. He feels safe, and that safety is everything to me. Last Christmas came and went without an invitation from my parents, and for the first time that absence didn't hurt. It didn't sting or trigger guilt or make me question myself, because we didn't need an invitation from people who never truly made room for us. Instead, we spent Christmas at Sarah and Jim's house, where the tree was too big for the living room, and the food covered every surface, and the noise felt warm instead of overwhelming. There were too many presents and too many hugs, and no one made Tommy feel like he took up too much space. At one point, Tommy walked over to Sarah and handed her a small, crooked card he had made himself that said "Thank you for loving me" in shaky letters. She read it once, then again, and then she cried openly without trying to hide it, and I cried too, because in that moment something inside me finally settled. I realized that walking away from my parents was never about punishment or revenge or proving a point. It was about protection. It was about choosing my child over people who only knew how to love when it benefited them. My parents still tell others that they don't understand why I walked away, and that hurts less than it used to because I understand perfectly now. I understand that they wanted access without responsibility and loyalty without compassion and gratitude without effort. I understand that they confused entitlement with family and obligation with love. And once I saw that clearly, I couldn't unsee it. Family isn't the people who demand things from you when you're at your weakest, or who see your grief as an opportunity. Family isn't the ones who keep score or place conditions on belonging. Family is the people who stand beside you in the mess and the quiet and say you don't have to do this alone, and then prove it with their actions over and over again. Sitting in that warm living room watching my son laugh freely while Sarah refilled plates and Jim helped him put batteries in a toy, I finally understood something Mark had always known and lived by. That love isn't loud promises or shared bloodlines or last names. Love is consistency and presence and showing up even when it's uncomfortable. And as I looked around that room at the people who had chosen us without hesitation, I felt something I hadn't felt since before Mark died, a sense of belonging that didn't come with fear or guilt attached. It wasn't the life I planned, and it wasn't the family I was born into, but it was real and solid and safe. And for the first time in a long time, I knew, without doubt, that my son and I were exactly where we were meant to be. Not because everything was perfect or pain-free, but because we were surrounded by people who loved us the right way, and in that realization, I finally felt like we were home.